welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help us all transform state politics. We know that we could have a state that truly represents the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful Commonwealth. And today, we are actually going to be talking unusually about national politics. The election just happened. It did not go the way that I think many of the listeners to this podcast would have liked. And we want to talk about what lessons we can take away from it. And before we even start, I want to say that the three of us are going to disagree, right? And we absolutely love and respect each other so much. We're really excited. We're all like grinning about this conversation where we are definitely going to have some very different opinions and continue to respect each other. And we hope that you guys will enjoy. And with that being said, before we go on, I would love to introduce my co-hosts. I will start with Jordan.
Jordan Burke Powers, he, him. I've worked in politics, and I am genuinely, I was like, we should put this on air. Let's disagree. So I'm glad to disagree.
Oh, yes. And Jonathan.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, been working on different issue and electoral campaigns for a little over a decade, and since we'll be talking about presidential stuff today, have been doing stuff since the 2012 presidential race.
Excellent. Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. I was actually 100% disengaged in politics, never voted in a primary, never voted in a city or local until the Bernie Sanders campaign, just so people understand where I'm coming from. Since then, basically quit everything else in my life and have only politics. So it was somewhat transformative for me. And that is the three of us. Do either of you want to say any more? Like Jonathan, you said a minute about like the 2012 campaign. Do we want to give a little bit of like our, backgrounds or anything before we dive in?
Oh God, I'm just going to be so old. Go ahead, Jonathan.
We see the grays, Jordan. We see the grays.
Oh, I know. Jonathan, do you want to say more?
I can just be super quick that when it comes to this is we're looking at a background of presidential, particularly as it relates to presidential politics. My first time ever working on a campaign was the 2012 presidential campaign in Philadelphia after grad school, back at my parents' condo, kind of near downtown in Philadelphia. And if you know Philadelphia, Fairmount. That ended up becoming a campaign fellow with the campaign there, managing teams in Fairmount and Francisville. Found Philadelphia to be a very exciting place to be working on a presidential campaign because the goal is getting people out to vote more so than it's kind of retention, mobilization, more than it is what I call like the New Hampshire situation, where you talk with a bunch of strange, swingy white people who can vote any which way in any given election, all of whom are former state legislators. That the Philadelphia environment is very different. It was a positive one. It's what also got me wanting to stay involved in campaigns and have obviously been in a number of them since. For thinking presidentially, was active in the Sanders campaign in 2016. Ended up being less active presidentially in the 2020 primary. As somebody who liked both Sanders and Warren, and eventually voted for Sanders after I thought Warren had no path. And did work in the general election then during the COVID when everybody was at home running things.
Background.
Oh God. So my first campaign was in 1994, volunteering for Marjorie Masgoli-Mazvinsky and Allison Schwartz in the Philadelphia suburbs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I worked on some congressional campaigns and some Senate campaigns, and then I did a small stint in the 2003 for the 2004 presidential election, the 2003 Democratic primary well, God, I feel weird to even talk about it, but just to say I worked on that campaign cycle, and I swore off Democratic presidential politics after that, and not wanting to work on it, and I actually left the country after that election in 2004, and I had no plans to come back until Katrina. And so I did come back and worked in politics and mostly worked in state elections since then. And so that is like the very short version of my campaign work. But I'd sort of done every level of campaigns and started, in the Bush, sort of pre-Bush and Bush years. So Clinton Bush years of federal races.
Okay, I'm going to get us started, in part because we started just, chit-chatting before we hit record record, and it was so engaging that we
Yes.
oh my God, stop.
No,
We gotta hit record and just get this on air.
we can start with Jordan if you want to talk about the thread that you had done recently. Let's start with that and some of the
Oh,
posts.
yes. Okay. So
Oh.
in 2016, so I was obviously at Mass Alliance, and following the 2016 election, I was personally very curious about what was going on with white voters. And I was worried about what we were seeing, not just in that poll, but in a bunch of polls we were doing around economic issues and other stuff, that we were seeing very specifically white people moving into all sorts of weird directions. And I wanted to understand that better so that we could talk about progressive issues in a way that these voters could hear. So we did. So we partnered with one of our best donors, a few of actually of our best donors, and a well-known, renowned pollster, and we polled voters who had formerly been Democrat, who voted for Trump. So and we did some polling, so like some asking questions that we asked, so that you get answers that they sort of reflect your questions. And then we did focus groups in Worcester County with white voters who are non-college educated, who had again sort of fit that. So you do a poll, you talk to people on the phone, and then we called back some of those people that we called and said, do you want to show up in person for some money to talk about those issues? And we divided people up by women and men, and we did 2 different groups of them. Sorry, 4 in total, but like 2 different times. And so those focus groups surfaced a lot of things that were very informative for me. And I created a memo, which basically mostly got ignored, but I did lead to some electoral victories. The things that are positive that I learned. So let's start with the positive, and I'll talk about all the negative. The positive is we figured these are people who voted for Trump, had moved conservative. We were not going to ask them about abortion. So we asked women, so the 20 women in total, 10 and 10 each, about the state of women's, like, how is it to be a woman in America? I think something like that. That was roughly the question. And in the focus group, so they're in a small room, they're talking to each other. I can see them from video, but they don't know I'm Black and not in the room, right? So they don't know we're there. They just know the person's there. And they immediately went to Planned Parenthood and abortion. And when we asked about abortion, there was not like general support. It wasn't higher or lower, but they immediately identified women's rights as abortion. And I was like, oh, we can't pull this. It's not polls are not catching how much women are linking their futures to abortion. We need to double down on abortion. And we did. And that's how Becca Rausch and Trom Nguyen won, is from that focus group. We learned that women and abortion, and we were ahead of the curve on that. And I told everybody in every state I could that we had, like, you need to replicate this. And they did. And they were seeing it in all of their states. So so this was happening before that. For all of those things, we were seeing that happening. Women were getting that cues. The bad news was that we really don't understand the depth of culture around anti-immigrant racism and transphobia. And I actually, this is the first, so I wrote about it for the first time publicly. I never write about it publicly. The reason I don't write about it publicly is because the left, unfortunately, does this thing. And generally, as our society, we hear somebody holds a view, so they're a bad person. And we dismiss them. We want to throw them out. We want to get rid of them. And I don't want that. These are my family members. These are people I am arguing with on text right now. This is where I went to high school in rural Pennsylvania. I cannot describe to you how few people of color and how red where I went to high school is. These are the people I know. Like, these are not foreign people. And so I don't come at this to say like they're bad. There's bad people and good people and all of the simplicity that our society has. But we need to also understand the depth of, I think, I'll speak for myself, that this was not hard to scratch the surface. They were in a room of 10 other people who they saw as like people, and a white person asking them questions. And everything we filtered through them, they filtered through the lens of what they were getting culturally, which was anti-immigrant and anti-Black and anti-trans, very specifically. And I'll give you some specific examples of this. We asked them, the opioid crisis was a big deal. They said that we asked them, like, should you, like, about like corporations and things. They were like, the people who are responsible for the opioid things are Black people and immigrants who are giving them to our kids. They didn't say like they were just like corporations. No, it's Black people, it's brown people. Like they immediately went to that. We asked them about school funding. They said the reason schools don't have money is because Obama is giving free money to Black people and trans people. Like that's obviously unhinged nonsense, but that's what they told us. Like, and so, and when we asked them where they're getting their information, it was YouTube, it was social media, it was they were like local news and Facebook, which is like like local news station and Facebook, right? So local news we know has a history of incredibly reactionary and racist and ideas. They also I think the other thing that we're missing, and I'll stop talking after this, is that the other thing that local media does, and I actually started watching local news, and when I say local media, I mean like your local news station. The stories, the feel-good stories that they tell are actually very regressive and conservative. They fall into old ideas on who a man is, who a woman is. Women are makeup, baking, like motherhood. Like there are very traditional ideas on what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. And so even the positive stories fit into a narrow idea of our society. And those are the places that are creating culture for them. They are telling them how to understand the world, interpret the world. It was wild. We couldn't, like, we asked them, like, are corporations, like, should we tax them, or are they like ripping you off? They were like, no, I mean, corporations give me my job. We should give them tax cuts. So we could identify for them that a person was a bad person. So like we could convince them that Elon Musk, for example, I mean not back then, but we could convince them that a certain rich person was bad. But the idea that like they were all embarrassed billionaires like showed up immediately. Like it was bad. So anyway, so I want to say that like we really need to grapple with the ways in which there is $1 billion of industry of bots, of Russia, telling a segment of not just a segment, all of us, all the time. We just usually get other sources, so we're not maybe getting as much about the ways in which we should think of the world, and it is racist, it is sexist, it is absolutely homophobic, right? It is really entrenching some terrible values, and I just think we need to grasp the depth of that. That was essentially my thread.
Can I know,
Okay.
Anna, you look like you're about to jump, so
to.
you can feel free to, and I have some stuff to chime in as well.
Oh, okay. I will jump in. To me, like the reason I think this is such an interesting topic is if we tie this to the election that just happened, right? Then people learn a lot of lessons that I think are the wrong lessons to learn. And number one, I think look, I believe that every single person that grew up in America is racist and sexist. Like, so don't get me wrong. Absolutely. That is like a fundamental belief of mine. Look, it's just real. Me too. You, both of you.
Yeah.
Like everyone listening to this. And it's part of what I really dislike, the sort of holier than thou, like I'm an anti-racist and therefore I'm perfect and good and don't have to do anything and everybody else is bad, right? And so all of this stuff like really turns me off, the sort of judgmental way. And this is the second point. It's not just in that it's sort of, we swim in it, but I do not believe that is the primary reason or simply the explanation that we can go to for the reality of why a specific candidate loses. Number two, it is a huge turnoff. Like it really, people who hear that, and I think the media, frankly, is worse than anybody, like the MSNBC, Joy Reids and whatever, those people who are basically like, well, Latinx men are, culturally sexist, and that's why they wouldn't vote. It's just like, oh my God, like they voted for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. So don't, let's be a little more, let's not, like when you say those blanket statements about people, it's such a turnoff to the left and to the Democratic Party generally. I think we think that it's okay to say those things because what Donald Trump is saying sounds so much more horrible. They're murderers, but it really is like a condescending turnoff for people to hear that kind of language. But I also think that it misses a really two very important things. Number one is the candidate. And you know what? Barack Obama was a freaking amazing candidate. The guy was just amazing. He was, and I do think that I talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, let's just like make these regression analyses of all of the districts in Massachusetts and all of the races that won and lost and whatever. And I'm like, you're missing the fact that the most important thing in any election is the actual person who is the candidate. That's number one. And the number two thing that people I believe, aren't talking about enough is, we have been for many, many years in change elections. We have been in elections where people are so angry, they will just vote for either the other party or anybody who's going to promise change. And I think that is the aspect that people are only just now beginning to wake up to. But I think it is part of why Obama won, because he was open change. I think that message won then. I think that message wins now. But we're not delivering the message. We're also not governing with that. And oh my gosh, I could go on forever, and I should let you guys talk. For one other thing, hopefully we can talk about is, like, to me, everybody is focused on talking about the campaign, and nobody's focused on talking about how the Democratic Party actually governed. And that is what I believe would truly have changed this election.
So let me chime in with a few different things. One, to the point before when you were talking about polling and voters, I thought this was an interesting thing. I don't know which article it came from, but it was tweeted by Jeff Stein from the Washington Post, quoting Celinda Lake, a Democratic pollster, talking about voter focus groups, where she noted that everybody knows what Trump economics is: China, tariffs, tax cuts. Then you go to ask them, what are Democratic economics? And someone will make a joke about welfare, and half the people can't name anything. And I feel like it speaks to kind of both of even what you were saying, where a lot of the knee-jerk thing of that is just flat out racism, right? That their initial response to what's a Democratic economic, it's just racist, right? They're just somebody making a racist joke and the others not knowing anything. It also speaks to a messaging failure that I don't think Democrats are good at communicating the stuff. And so that it's like one can't, like, they're both things are true. That, like, it's true about that electorate writ large that you're dealing with, but it's also true that Democrats are typically not very good at messaging. And this is one of my other points thinking of when you were talking about the way it was easy to get, Jordan, when you were talking about the way it was easy to get people to understand a specific person as a villain, but in a way that was difficult for them to view corporations as bad. Reminds me is one thing that I think is too often a problem in Democratic politics is an embrace of villainless politics.
Yeah.
Because
yes,
when you have villainless, like, people understand that for them to gain, somebody else has to lose in most scenarios, and whether that's always true or if that's not, it's beside the point. It's how people see the world. And so that if you talk about, and it's one thing where, like, if people actually voted on policies, and there have been studies even showing if you ask people about Harris's policies, you ask people about Trump's policies, they liked Harris's policies more, if as long as you didn't tell them who the policies came from. I do think that one of the problems is not the lack of policy content, which I think some of the criticisms of her is unfair. Would I want her to go bolder on many things? Yes. But anything that she was offering was decent and was popular. But to tell the narrative in such a way that, like, when talking about price gouging in a way where there isn't actually a price gouger in your story about price gouging is a problem. That misses that fundamental way that people understand villain. Like, let me pulling up, had a joke before, and I'm trying to find my screenshot of it, where I remember back 5 years ago, I had joked that I was penning my my musical about political campaigns that was going to have a song, Gotta Have a Villain. This was inspired, for those of you who know too much about musical theater, if any of you have seen the show like Spam-A-Lot, there's a whole song about how you can't have a show on Broadway if you don't have any Jews. It was inspired kind of by this, about how you don't have a story if you don't have any villain. Like, you need a villain. Per story of my, like, you can have 5,000 heroes, 10 Harrys, 12 Katnisses, 1 Dylan, but you don't actually have a story if you don't put in a villain. And I think that that's something that Democrats often don't understand, that if you're talking about solving the problems that they experience, you increase the intensity and the felt belief that you're doing something if you talk about, well, this specific actor is the bad one and we're taking them on. And I think if you leaving that out creates a problem. Macro comment on the election that I think speaks to kind of mix of things is that you do have, as some people have pointed out, have had in a number of, pretty much in most Western countries, and I think Spain is really the only exception, you've had all of the parties in power during the post-pandemic inflation lose when put up to vote. Because if you ask people, are you better off than you were a few years ago? And their main way of understanding that is the cost of things, they will say no. That doesn't it ignores the fundamental fact that the person in charge is not necessarily like Biden isn't setting the prices of eggs. That's
They're
that's
not
not what
magic?
was that right?
They're not magic? Oh, yeah.
Right? It's like that's not how it works. And we suffer from a large degree of fundamental economic illiteracy in this country. But that's still right. But
I
that's
disagree with you, and I think we should talk about this.
okay, but I'm saying,
Great.
but that is how
Yes.
that is how people experience it, and I think that there is a problem of it's difficult to tell people, well, the economy is actually good now if their experience of that is not that, because then you're like talking across kind of in cross purposes, and then you need to actually acknowledge that, and I think that that's something that needs to be done better. My point was, if you have that as a macro explaining a certain degree of fundamentals, I think that there's also what Jordan was noting earlier, that people, given racism and sexism that exist, are willing to give somebody like Trump the benefit of the doubt. They're never going to afford Harris because they typically are willing to associate like the white male CEO as somebody who knows what he's doing in the way that they typically will not have a black woman. I also, and one thing I'm curious to see if there's research on, I do feel like that there's probably a way in which the general sexism that can exist, and this is not just male sexism, female sexism, the way in which it's kind of a universal thing. My guess is it gets exacerbated by female candidates who appear professional class. And that I think Harris definitely does, and I feel Clinton definitely does. And I don't think that for somebody like Tammy Baldwin, for instance, in Wisconsin, does in the same way. I don't think that Amy Klobuchar does in the same way. And that's something that exists kind of across race, that like the appearance of like woman who was successful in her field exacerbates that sexism. That it says nothing about who should run, etc. But saying that that's something that where we need to address the underlying, like we need to address that sentiment in the population at large, in order to actually have the successful outcomes that we want in elections.
Right. So if can I jump in?
Anna, you go and then I'll go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was actually going to suggest that we talk about something. So if you have a reaction to him, you go first, and then I'll suggest. And then
I have a reaction to you, but I was like, I was gonna disagree with you. So like let's order ourselves up. So I guess I'll say I genuinely think I disagree. I think one is I think a black woman has those sort of interlocking identities in a way that being black or being a woman isn't. So I actually do think it mattered to a lot of voters, even voters who we think of as people of color, that she was both. That I think that's like, it's like too many things, too many. I like to joke, it's like too many pieces of flair. Like I don't only take a few at a time. I could take one at a time, but like there's a lot going on. I do think, I wonder if there's a lot there, Jonathan, that I think is worth following up about. Like, is there like, how do we think about women, and like, like, are they like one of us or not? And like the way in which, because I think the other thing that I think you're right about, Anna, is that, I always tell people that like Obama and Trump ran the same campaign, only with less racism. Like Obama ran as an outsider. People are pissed off with where their lives are going, and where the country's going, and it's becoming more and more. It's becoming harder and harder. And the thing that Harris, the problem of her campaign is like she's in a time where she's trying to defend institutions at the same time as these institutions are failing, and it's sort of hard to do that. It's hard to like and that's a really tough place when people are generally not happy with the things with the places you're going. I don't and I want to also lift up, I think, what you said, which is like the reason we were all excited about Walz is it's so funny the way people are like, Walz is this progressive. Walz was the most conservative congressperson, but you know what he said? He said he listened to people. and changed his mind. How about that?
Yeah.
And then he also said that, like, part of the thing he said is like, well, when people give you power, you have to deliver back to them.
Mhm.
So he understood who gave him power as a conservative Democrat and delivered for those people. And like, that's actually the thing that's been missing for generations for Democrats is they get
Mhm.
power and they don't deliver for people. See Massachusetts. And we all agree with that. And
Yeah.
that is a huge problem. That puts you in this scenario where people, where people would say, I don't believe Harris will do that. The funny thing is they say, I don't believe Trump will do the things he says, and I don't believe Harris will do the things he says. And the problem is that Harris would have tried and maybe not gotten to it, and Trump is actually going to do all the things he said.
Well,
And
whatever. It's a thousand things. Good.
the one thing,
Contradictory. Who
this
knows?
is a super quick thing, and then Anna, if you had a comment to jump in before, note that I think is also a problem, and I feel like this again speaks to Jordan, the focus group stuff around corporations, is I think that we have a bipartisan problem in this country where we both coming out of the parties and coming out from the media that associates CEO with smart, good on
Yes.
the economy,
Yes.
successful, etc. So that you have a situation where there are many
greedy and zero empathy.
exactly like where so you have so many people can be like, oh, Trump's going to create jobs because he's a successful businessman, or he's going to be good on the economy, and no real amount of actual facts can like infiltrate that belief that people have that's cultivated both from his media image as well as from years of popular culture and really both parties telling people that the CEOs are successful and whom you should be listening to on the economy. And so when an economy is not like people aren't experiencing economy as good, they think that that person can fix it and are like, again, it's another way in which people will give him a benefit of the doubt that they will not attribute her. And the other quick thing I would note that I think this goes to Jordan, your point about like Harris and the relations to institutions is one thing that I think was always a very difficult needle to thread. If you were the vice president running to continue is you can't really be like it was fascinating because I was at the Philadelphia rally. I've watched video rally clips before, but I was at the Philadelphia one on Monday. And Harris's team tried to lean into generational change, knowing that people wanted to change, of being kind of a younger candidate, someone with a fresh start. It's hard to be a change candidate if you're the party currently in control. Because, and it's also if Biden has been unpopular for a number of years, like for probably about 2 years now, right? In terms of favorability polling. If you are the vice president of a currently unpopular president, it is a very difficult needle to thread because you don't really then there are good accomplishments. There are things I like from the Biden administration, there are things I don't, but there are real things in the record to run from or to run on. But if he's not popular, you're not going to lean into those because he's not popular. And so it's not a useful thing to start talking about all of the things that you and Joe Biden did together. You have to suddenly lose all of that. But then so you're saddled with all of the negatives of being an incumbent, but you have none of the benefits of being an incumbent.
Absolutely.
And it was also always I think the difficulty with everything, like she should say how she's different from Joe Biden. That's a fundamentally difficult thing to do when you're the sitting vice president who is a part of that administration. There are some ways I would love for her to have broken from him, and there are ways I wouldn't have liked her to break from him. But it to me was always described as an easier task of doing than I think it fundamentally was. Although also, last comment, and then handing over to Anna, despite all of that, I do think that the fact that Democrats didn't have a total rout in the Senate and like will at least leave the House, and if Republicans keep the House narrowly, is because of the switch that happened over the summer on the ticket. That I do think that if Biden had stayed on the ticket, it probably would have been a rout.
Sure, you're just gonna drop that and leave. Yeah, whatever. Go ahead, Anna.
Here's what I want us to cover because I think we do have differing opinions on this, and I think this will be fun.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, you said something about how, oh, people associate the economy with prices, and they don't understand that the president can't just perform magic and make prices go down. And Jordan, I'm pretty sure that on this podcast, at least before and after, that you have a number of times talked about the Biden presidency as being like really one of the best, in recent memory. And I will admit that maybe even if I haven't pushed back, I don't see it. And I'll also say, like, I am probably among the top 1 or 2% of like Americans in terms of my political awareness. And if
Yeah.
I don't see it, and like often, you're
Oh,
mentioning
yeah.
a bunch of wonky policies, and I'm like, like if I don't see it as an incredibly engaged person, the average person probably doesn't see it. And
Yes.
so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about delivering for the working class and whether the Democrats have been, whether they've done enough, whether people are simply hoping for a magical price, whatever from the president, and they're being unrealistic, or whether the Democratic Party has not done enough.
So I think I just want to say, I'm going to quote actually Jonathan's thread he had on Blue Sky, which is that it's hard to imagine what the alternative is, right? But we actually do have what happens in the alternative. And I actually think Barack Obama, so I often say that Joe Biden is the president that people imagine Barack Obama to have been. I believe the reason we can't have a black woman president is because Barack Obama was a pretty mediocre to terrible president. And I genuinely think that the reason that we can't have that Democrats are have trouble is because he used high fluent progressive language to push Eisenhower Republican ideas. And so they never were going to live up to the transformation that he said, and in fact, made people's lives substantially worse. So what do I mean by that? The way that he approached a financial decline is to do a little bit of stimulus with a lot of austerity. So people's lives got worse. The federal government put less money into local governments. People got squeezed at the bottom. And so that allowed for a middle class to be okay, and for middle and lower income folks to be worse off because of Obama economics. So what does that tell you about? So all of those people who were Obama people who left the party because he promised them one thing and then delivered the opposite. Their lives got worse. And then you add to that the fact that no one is talking about transforming people's lives. So no one's talking about a reimagination of like how people could their relationship to working. So like no one's talking about the fact that you shouldn't have to work 4 jobs, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about making it so that you only have to work 3 jobs. And so we're not talking about those transformational changes. So the problem is that you've made it worse and all these things. So when I say that the Biden is that, like, we could have done it the way Obama did it. We could have used austerity and slowly tried to get out of this thing, and you wouldn't have had inflation. Also, people's lives would have been far worse off. And so what the problem is, it's hard to imagine the opposite, but we actually do know what that looks like. It looks like the slow growth and the growing, the Tea Party, the hatred, all the things that happened, the sort of feeding the thing that fed this moment. That's what it looks like. And that's honestly what happened in Europe. That's what's happening in Europe, right? You have these, it was mostly austerity with a little bit of growth, and you feed you feed sort of resentment and right-wingness because people are like, well, I'm getting something, but I'm not getting enough, and it's not really changing, and I need to blame somebody for that. So that's the problem, is that, like, yes, Biden used classic Keynesian. He taxed some rich people and he spent a shit ton of money on regular people to make the economy soar out of the problem. That isn't a transformation. That isn't a change in the dynamics of people's lives. But the fact that there aren't long bread lines, there isn't huge unemployment, the fact that mostly people can find work, that's a benefit to Keynesian economics. And that's what I mean when I say he did those things. On top of the fact that, like, so I heard this person talk about yesterday. I had a class on the environment, and this person had really well-reasoned criticism for the ways in which we approach climate and the ways in which Americans expect our standard of living to survive. And that's basically coming at the cost of the planet and other people who aren't afforded the same rights. So currently we have it put in place the fact that even though we make up 4% of the population, we make up 50% of the emissions. And we are enshrining that into the future. not to mention that how unfair that is for other people who might need to grow more than 4% to get out of their economic situations. And she says all this, and somebody in the class, rightly says, that's a really good point. But I feel like Biden tried to do a little bit. He tried to push in the right directions, but like also made to like get it passed because I had to pass a bill. He pushed in the wrong direction. He did really transformative things on methane and also opened up more gas. Like he did try to both. Like, how do we go where you want to go, which is like we're no longer emitting and we're like trying to make up for our things when we can't even get people to do the bare minimum? And she was like, well, we just need to tell people what's happening. And I laughed. I literally laughed on the phone. And so I just think like part of it is like there is a reality that like he had 50 votes and 2 of them are people who suck at life. Like there is only so much he could do. And like I actually think that we got a lot with that. And it's not what I wanted. It's not like I loved Bernie Sanders' first plan. Like sign me up for that. Of course, like it's not that I think that it was like the best thing, but it's the best in my lifetime. And that's really what I'm trying to say. And yes, people don't get that because you don't understand you can't fundamentally understand what could have been. Like what isn't quite there. And also, to your point, we didn't change the dynamics of like housing is too expensive. Mm-hmm. Healthcare is not affordable. Like nobody was proposing transformative change in that way.
Yeah. I think my basic take on it, and what I hear, and I, been listening to a lot of podcasts and stuff on the election, of course, I'm sure we all have. And I hear a lot of people like mentioning a lot of very specific things that Biden did with the NLRB and the Build Back Better, that the pieces of Build Back Better that actually ended up passing or whatever. And I really think we have to have a simpler metric because it's too easy to get lost in these details, right? And to me, like, look, I went to urban planning graduate school. Inequality was my favorite topic, wage inequality, wealth inequality. I did a lot of research in it, wrote some papers in it. So there's a lot of things that researchers who study inequality do understand, which is when inequality gets too high, you get political unrest. And this is what we are seeing, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to suggest maybe 2 different ways that people can think about it that are very simple. One, inequality, that's a little too cerebral for a lot of people. Like there's the Gini coefficient, the dissimilarity index, blah, blah, blah. Like these are all mathematical terms. And people often argue, which I understand, oh, who would ever think about that? And that doesn't actually affect people. It does. But what I want to mention as an alternative is what percentage of people don't have $500 in the bank in case of emergency? Like what percentage of people? And the percentage of people at this point is like definitely over 50%. I don't know if it's gotten to 60% yet, but like $500 is a root canal. Like that's, mm-hmm. Your kid breaks a bone. Like these things, because of our healthcare system, happen to people all the time. Your car that you need to get to work, something goes wrong with it. Like that's $500. So the number of people who live precarious lives where they literally do not know if tomorrow they're not going to be able to pay their rent, like you cannot. And this is what I want us to look at in terms of presidencies. Like there has not been a presidency in 30 years that has lowered inequality, that has reduced the number of people whose lives are precarious. And when you get to this level, I am sorry, nobody is going to be satisfied with the status quo. And they're going to vote for anybody who will promise change. It doesn't matter how outrageous they are. It doesn't matter what they say. To me, this is the Trump phenomenon. And this is the number one reason, I think, why Trump won, why he won in 2016, why he won now. And I'm not saying that the country isn't racist. People like I said at the beginning, I think we all have sexism like built in, but there is something else that we could change. But I think the Democratic Party is unwilling to do.
I just want to say really quickly, and this is the part where we disagree very kindly. So I just want to say this. And this is the part I disagree. I think you could make people's lives better, and fundamentally they will always choose racism and sexism because I fundamentally think people just don't want to be Black because they know what it means to be Black in America. And so I do think that and I think part of the promise of Obama was that he was going to like absolve them of that. And the fact that he didn't is why they're even angrier. So I don't want to, and I want to say that this is unknowable. So like when I say that when we said in the beginning we disagree, and we respect each other, and I don't want to say I genuinely love every person on this thing, and I probably love the people thing. We don't know this. There's no way to know this. This is an unknowable thing because it's a mixture of all of these things together. But my inclination towards this is like there's just something deeper that we have to figure out how to tackle, as well as all the other things. Like I think the one thing I could say is we all agree that like actually delivering for people and changing some of these really big dynamics would change the ground. And for me, I think part of this is we can't like we have to also tackle the culture part to this of like how do we like the fact that I like what I also see is a retrenching of gender roles. Like we lived in a time where like girls could wear yellow and lots of ways in which we think of the way men and women go about their day. What are they? What products do they buy? How do they think? Like those are moving in directions that they went one direction and now they're going back another direction. And I think all of those things to me are signals to where we're going. And I do think like when you say like one of the things I wanted to also point out is like some of the things people say is like, oh well, Latino men voted for Clinton and now they voted, but that's like a lot of people different. Like there's a lot of people who have come for things, and I think actually there's some fundamental sexism that's embedded in the same way it's embedded in other cultures, right? Like it's not like particular to one group of people, but I think what Black people experience so much racism in America that even though a lot of Black people hold all of the same conservative values like we're just as likely to be as conservative as any white person, but America's so racist that we see ourselves together, despite that. Despite the fact that many of us hold many very conservative viewpoints, because we're so racist, we still that holds together. And and then if you don't experience that marginalization in that same way, it's hard to hold that together, that other things start to matter in that mixture in a way. So I think I want to and I just want to leave again to say like I don't disagree with Anna in the sense that like we might disagree at the like what percentage, how do we think about it, things. I think I disagree, but in a way that's saying like I don't know that I'm right. And I want to say that as respectful as possible, because I think too often we have they're happening online, they're happening with each other, where we're saying it with a certainty that just that's unwarranted. We're all guessing. We're all trying to do our best.
And it's all of these, right? It's all of these things are true. Yeah.
A few quick things. One, and this, I was thinking when you were talking about like whether they're even the same people in a situation. I do feel like, and like we won't be able to speak to this until we get full data from the election. That I think one problem I always have and how people talk about demographics in the election is that there is there's a composition issue with any election. Like the people who voted in 2020 are not the same people who voted in 2024. They're not the same people who voted for 2016. Some people age into the electorate. Some people die. Some people choose not to vote. Some people who didn't vote before choose to. And so all of that creates an interesting scenario where like how all of those factored into movements in different demographics is something that we don't know yet, of whether or not some like rightward shifts are as much people flip at people who voted before changing how they voted, and how much of it is new people who didn't vote before voting, and how much of it is people who voted before not voting. Because that happens in all directions. The one thing I would say as well when looking at like the kind of the general milieu of racism and sexism and that kind of exist is it's one thing that I describe as the difference between affirmatively going and casting a vote for Trump and staying home. Because I can understand the disillusionment, the pox on both houses disillusionment that leads you to say, I'm not even bothering to vote. But to me, if you're making the active choice of saying, I'm going to vote and that vote is for Donald Trump, that's definitely something that's shaped by that culture of racism and sexism, where you see him as that guy who we already had in office, who was terrible and is constantly is running the most misogynistic campaign that we have probably seen in the country's like, given that there haven't been that many female candidates, you can like narrows the exact number of them, right? And I don't know all how misogynistic any like past campaigns talking about women's ability to vote way back when are. I don't know how much that was in the presidential campaign, so I'm just making all of those caveats of how just flagrantly misogynistic his campaign system was. You're going to the ballot and you're like making that affirmative choice as opposed to staying home, which if one is upset with the way things are, you can say like it's a rational decision to say none of you are doing anything and I'm staying home. And it's a different decision to say I don't trust you, but I'm voting for the schmuck.
Yeah, I will say that I think that paints too broad for me, that paints too broad a
Yeah.
brush. For me, that paints every single person who voted for Trump as somebody who, like, in the judgmental sense, is like a racist and a sexist. And I genuinely don't see it that way. I think that there are a lot of people who, I mean, I was listening to Democracy Now! And she had a Palestinian organizer, and that person was like, Donald Trump says horrible things, but the Biden administration slaughtered like 80 of my family members. So if you think that I'm going to vote for the slaughterer instead of the person who says ugly things, I don't mind that he says ugly things. So
But
well, and
But
look,
that person could have voted for Jill Stein. That person could
yeah,
have voted
yeah.
for
I'm
Jill
sorry, that's
Stein.
bonkers town.
And so, like, if that person chooses, like, there literally was a candidate on the ballot who, if that's like your animating issue, is the one who, like,
Yeah,
is the one to vote for. And that you see that as well, even in like the results of Dearborn, you did see Jill Stein do fairly
oh
well
yeah,
there because of that.
won more
And
votes than
so
Harris by
to
a lot.
me, like, that's the kind of, if you're then choosing affirmatively Trump as rather than Jill Stein on that issue, it's because you're voting on other issues where you probably actually just agree with Trump.
yeah. I guess that's a level of nihilism that I don't think animates that many people in the thing. And like, also just like, I don't want to tell a person who lost individual
Yeah.
people how they're grieving in a way, and how how that grieving is reflecting in what they do in politics. Like, that's, I have, as I don't think we discussed on here, but I've discussed, like,
Mhm.
I had loved ones in Gaza on that day. So like,
Mhm.
I don't want to judge. I would never judge. Like, I think like there is, it's an impossible thing for me to want to
Yeah.
dive into. I do want to say that I don't think, I think the problem, I guess you're right, that we broad with this broad brush, and then, or we do this other thing, which is we sort of say like, well, everyone's racist and sexist, so like that's sort of, and I guess I want to say is, you have to, people who voted for Trump knew that they're voting for explicit authoritarianism, racism, and sexism. And I do think that says something about that electorate. And it doesn't mean that every person is the same. Like, there's a
Mhm.
wall and you're a black and white on either side, or that we don't share many of those values. The left is very much replicating some of the authoritarian that we're growing up in. Like, it is around us. We are in
Mhm.
fascism. But I also don't think that we should. I do think that there is something in the cultural milieu that we need to tackle. About, it is a heightened sense of anti-immigrant,
Mhm.
anti-LGBTQ. Like, there is a lot, and the anecdotes to that are not to say, again, not to throw dispose people, but like education, having people talk to, loved by people of color when they can be, by their trans family members, talking to them if they can. Like, I wouldn't force those conversations on anyone, but
Yeah.
the more that we can be thoughtful about, like, we need to have these conversations and not dismiss people, but also not accept it. I think that's really important. There's somewhere in there is the work I think we have to do,
Eh,
because I do think there is something that's animating, right? Because Jonathan's right; they could just do other things, and I wish that the answer was that I want to live in a world where, if America had done less to support the violence in Gaza, that would have been an election victory for Harris. But I am not convinced that is the case. I would love for that to be true. That would really align with my my peaceful values and a worldview of a life without violence. But I'm not there. But I do think it mattered.
I do want to bring something up, which is a lot of people have said, like, oh, the other side, they're voting for authoritarianism against democracy. And I have to bring this up because, a lot of times I think that people who don't vote are in fact actually smarter than the people who always vote, because they understand something
Yeah.
fundamental about the American system that the people who are always voting don't understand. And for example, like, I am shocked. I'm always shocked at the people the always voters who just believe campaign promises when obviously they're obviously false. It's like somebody who fought against something and then for their 6-term person, then they run on something and then they get in office and of course they then don't do it. Like they just believe this stuff in a way that the people who don't vote are in fact a little bit smarter than they are. They're wiser. And the thing that I think that people who voted for Trump, that they have understood that I think is real, is we do not live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy. And, they're not voting for like an autocracy or a fascism over democracy, which look, I'm not going to vote for fascism no matter what. And I think fascism is worse, but they're voting for it over an oligarchy, which is what we have, because they have come to understand that they cannot trust either party to vote for their interests. And everybody's like, oh, it's fascism over democracy, or it's autocratic, whatever, over democracy. And I do not think that that is the decision that they're making.
So one thing that I think is an important, like, I just want to quickly chime in, is one thing I think is always important when you're talking about, and this again gets to like speaking with too broad of a brush. There are people, if we're talking about Trump voters, it doesn't make sense as a defined category, in part because some of them are people who always vote Republican every single election. Some of them are people who swing. People who vote Republican every election will be somewhat different in their priorities than people who swing. I often think about when I think of, like, the suburb where I grew up outside of Philadelphia is historically Republican. It voted for Trump this time. It voted for Trump before. It voted for Trump again. I think it's because a lot of the people there has a lot of people who are racist, and they hate taxes. That is my understanding. What's also, I would say, even interesting is you have a dynamic between that town and the neighboring one that have the same property values, the same income levels, and the difference is education, where the neighboring one has a higher rate of college degrees than that one, and the neighboring town's foreign-born population is largely Asian American, and that our town's was largely Russian. And I think those factors speak to like that mix of culture, education status speaks to a difference, but between those two. But again, people who are well off in a well-off suburb who typically vote Republican will vote and vote Republican. So like, I don't think that if we're talking, it needs to be clear that if we're talking about certain people, you're talking about the marginal voter. Because the marginal voter is motivated differently than the reliable voter. There is a person who voted for Trump every time Trump has been on the ballot, and who also voted for Mitt Romney before, and who voted for Bush twice. And for that voter is a distinctive voter from a voter who voted for Trump only once or twice of his 3 times, or who the Obama to Trump voter, that they're motivated by that they're not inherently the same category. So that's why I think like there are Republican voters who just think like we live in an oligarchy. I love it. Let's keep it that right? Yeah. And like
I guess I do think that there is I guess I disagree. I think that there are America has never been it's never been a democracy in like you get what you put in. Like it's just like I vote for this thing and I get what I want. I agree. And I definitely think that we have especially our federal government has been, built as inequality gets bigger, we are more and more beholden to billionaires and their whims and their desires, and that is 1,000% true. And also, like, in my lifetime, my mom went from not being able to vote to being able to vote. Like, that is like a real thing that happened. Like, there is a lot of I don't want to sound like I don't agree with all of those things. I do think that, but I also don't think of democracy as like it's a there's a lot of little things that we take for granted that I think are going to go away, because I think that's actually how authoritarianism rises. So I guess to get to your point, I think yes, I agree. I think people are fed up and they're willing to have a person be like, fix this, fuck those people, let's just get rid of those, like let's have at those people in a way that yes, I think that's a lot. I think there's a lot of what's going on. It's just there's a really fed upness, and I agree. I think people should be fed up. Like it's not getting better. People's lives are getting worse, and and largely our political class, and especially our media class, which I think is, we haven't talked about, but actually to me, if you're like, what's the thing we could fix? It's like, I actually don't care about fixing Democrats. I actually care about our media system, which is why I keep talking about culture making. I actually think they're the problem, and not in the way that Trump is going to start arresting journalists he disagrees with. I mean, the ways in which they reinforce really bad values and are totally aligned with keeping their jobs, so that means making their billionaires happy, and not enough, like, this weddedness to both sidesism rather than facts. Their design, their ideas that, like, you need to filter everything through a moderation, which means that, like, you should moderate whether or not I'm a person or not, right? Like this impulse towards just like so not asking tough questions, not things. I think those are all part of the problem and part of culture making. So, like, I do want to say, like, it's not that I don't. I think we all agree. We're on this podcast because we agree that there's just fundamental shifts to our society that are absolutely needed. But I do think that there is like I actually do think that people are, like, a lot of Republican voters, they are towards, like, more authoritative. Like, there is a desire for easier answers with easier solutions. I mean, that's certainly what Putin believes, right? Like, Putin believes that the way the order should be, and, like, that's sort of his governing philosophy, is this idea that, like, people tend towards wanting, they will give up their individual liberty for the certainty of for certainty. That's actually it. And that's his understanding of the world, and to some extent that's a truth. I don't think it's a universal truth. I think that's true for some people, and to degrees. Again, because I don't think of it as like either or. I think of it as degrees. But
the one thing I want to chime in that the media comment reminded me of, and some other things I wanted to build off of a prior point as well, is what's annoyed me is how much that I've felt that, like, that xenophobia gets exacerbated by the media, because most people, like, if you're in, like, North Dakota complaining about immigrants, like, what is it? Somebody coming over from Canada?
yeah.
It is an entire, like, so much of that exists through media, right? It's through the things that you take in. It's not through your day-to-day lived experience. Healthcare costing too much is something that you experience every day. Immigrants coming over the border too much is simply not. And I think that one of the problems that you end up seeing, and this gets, I think, touched in different ways, is, as Jordan noted, if in focus groups and pollings, you do see a lot of voters hold very strongly anti-immigrant views. The problem that exists, both, I think, because of a media environment, I think a political class environment on the Democratic side, is the Democrats see that majority opinion from voters, and they respond to it by adopting the position. They follow that. They don't try to They don't try to change that position. They don't try to take another contradictory position held by the same voters
and try to elevate that one. The whole family separation thing was gigantic across the whole. It was huge. And it was because it was anti-Trump, and it was okay to be anti-Trump. But then, when the Republican Party then gets a little bit of power and starts being anti-immigrant, then they're like, oh, well, I guess that's popular. We'll just do it. I mean,
it's the worst. And they don't do this. They don't do that to us.
That in polling, voters overwhelmingly support mass deportations, but then if you tell them what that actually means, they're like, no.
I know, right?
It's like, I'm not talking about deporting the people I know.
Voters support a lot of things that a really amazing leader tell them to support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to. I think we should wrap up, because we could endlessly talk about this. But I want to end with just two things, and then everyone should go. The first thing I want to say is, like, I hope that this is a model for people to disagree with each other, but do so in a way that is, like, loving and supportive, and, like, boy, do we need each other right now, and not think that the other person is wrong or bad for disagreeing with us. Like, I just cannot say enough how much, not only do I you heard us disagree, and I will take in that disagreement into how I think about it. because I respect everyone here, and that will reflect. So I just want to say that like
Mhm.
that's really important. And the other thing is the thing I learned from 2016, which was like one of the things I used to do a lot was gatekeep. I was executive director of Mass Alliance, and a lot of people made a lot of asks of me, and I would be like, I don't know, yes, I'd like sort of try to gauge whether or not I want to do it. And after 2016, I made a rule to say yes to everybody. Like it didn't mean that every single person got all of my time, but it did mean that while they were in front of me, I treated it like they could be the solution to the problem, and I would give them my best advice. I would tell them who they should talk to. I would not gatekeep that relationship. And ultimately, people who had far out ideas often came back with a newer version of that idea that actually I thought was pretty good, pretty workable, but they had to come to it themselves. But I really cannot stress like there's not going to be one thing that solves this because there isn't one problem. And
Mhm.
so try to say yes to each other, try to support one another. Don't think that you have the right idea and they don't. They have the right idea and you have the right idea. How can we support each other? How can we say yes to each other? How can we show up for each other? Like that's the thing I want to take away is like if we are genuinely all moving in the right direction, then help people move in that direction
Mhm.
any way you can.
Wow, I can't even follow that. I love that so much. I remember in 2016, after the 2016 election, being in a room where somebody said, because there was this like, oh, new ideas, stop, no more new ideas, and somebody said, hey, if someone has broken into your house and is like sitting in your house and not letting you in, aren't you going to try the windows and the doors and the basement hatch and like get on the roof, like try
Yeah.
everything, right? So I'm 100% with you that we should really be trying and support people's ideas, even if you don't really see how it's going to work. So I love that.
Yes.
And then my other last comment is just, I want people to like look, number one, try to be less judgmental of others, even Trump voters, right? Try to be less judgmental and understand, have empathy for people. And then the other thing I want people to think about is inequality, or how many people live precarious lives, like that we really are. I think a lot of folks who are progressive tend to be a little bit on the wealthier side and aren't living that kind of life. And so if you are one of those folks, have some empathy, understand that a lot of the people who are making those votes are in fact people that we want to support. They are marginalized people. They are poor people, and that having empathy and trying to be kind and understanding, and really understand what they're going through and why they're making the kinds of decisions is going to get us to the place that we want to get.
My final comment is going to build off of Jordan's, and it's one of my favorite song lyrics. I will shout out, although it's not where this originated, that we recently hit the whatever number anniversary of the Brandy Cinderella. And the song, and I always love the line from the song Impossible, sung by Whitney Houston. In that movie, but the world is full of zanies and fools who don't believe in sensible rules and won't believe what sensible people say. And because these daft and dewy-eyed dopes keep building up impossible hopes, impossible things are happening every day. And I think that's always a wonderful line to think of.
Totally amazing. Well, thank you both so, so much, as always, for everything that you do, and also for today. Thanks to all of our listeners, to all of our supporters. Please donate. It's the link below, and we will see you all next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe, and it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.